Hi, I'm Rob Vischer. Welcome to my storytelling podcast, God Out Loud. With every new episode, you'll hear stories of people who say they heard God. Today, you'll hear from Barbara Jenkins, a woman who says God sent a messenger to ask her a strangely specific question. If you want to hear more God Out Loud stories, hit follow or subscribe now on your favorite podcast app. In February 2010, after 2.5 months of bicycling across America, then another 3 months of flying around the country to visit friends and family, I settled down for 1 semester as an artist in residence at a small songwriting school on the East Coast island of Martha's Vineyard, Massachusetts. Even though I was surrounded by the articulate professors and loving staff, I felt a little bit out of place. I was 27, fresh off the road from a quintessential Go West young man American adventure, and I was still drifting. I didn't have any money for entertainment or new clothes, and I was 5 years older than all of the students and many years younger than most of the staff. Perhaps that's why I felt pulled one night to visit the small one-room library in the center of campus. The small room featured built-in oak shelves that lined every wall with tightly packed paperback classics and old Christian bestsellers. As I skimmed the titles printed on each book's spine, one stood out to me: A Walk Across America by Peter Jenkins. I slowly opened it, read a few pages while standing in front of the bookshelf, read a few more pages after sitting on the couch, laid on the couch with the book still in my hands, and then eventually took the book back to my room and finished it over the course of 2 or 3 days. The book featured true stories of adventure, loss, and near the end, even romance. Since I was fresh off a bicycle trip across America and a single guy who just broke up with my girlfriend, I consumed every page relating closely to Peter, like a long-lost brother. When I read the end, I think I even cried. And because I didn't have anybody else to call at that point, I called my mom. "Have you ever read A Walk Across America, Mom?" I forget her answer, but she was familiar with the story of Peter and his wife, Barbara Jenkins. When I realized that, I asked her, "Why didn't you ever tell me about the story of how Peter and Barbara got married? How God spoke to them is unbelievable. How come you never told me?" My mom paused, and I'll always remember the answer she gave me. Her answer is what made me want to talk to Barbara Jenkins. Here's Barbara telling about the first time she saw Peter, sometime in April or May of 1975.
I always loved ancient history, biblical history, so I was working on a master's degree in New Orleans at a seminary, and we were having a roast or a party for professors that evening. Everybody was too serious, so we wanted to have fun, and the place was packed. The lounge in the women's dorm was packed with all the single male students there and several of the professors. So there was a young man there. He was not a student. I'd never seen him before, and he looked like he had just stepped out of a Viking movie. He had long strawberry blonde hair, big round saucer blue eyes, kind of ruddish with a red beard, and he truly looked like a Viking. And he caught my attention. I thought, who is that? I'd like to know more about him. Well, I did not meet him that night. Several weeks went by, and then one evening in the women's dorm, we were cooking and laughing, and one of the male students came in the kitchen, and he was kind of a flirt and a tease, and he threw some water on one of the girls. She threw water back at him, and before it was over, it was a full-blown Louisiana rainstorm in there, and we were filling up buckets and pitchers and throwing water. More guys came in. They heard the screaming and the laughing. So the place was full of all this out-of-control laughter from these young adults. And so I had a gallon pitcher of water. I was chasing this guy, was going to dump it on his head. He ran out the front door, got away from me, and there stood the Viking. I looked at him and dumped a gallon of water over his head. And that's how I met Peter Jenkins.
1 gallon of water quickly turned into a chase. The chase turned into an ice cream fight, and the ice cream fight turned into Peter and Barbara exchanging names and Barbara volunteering to show Peter around the New Orleans French Quarter the next night. That first tour of New Orleans lasted from 7:30 p.m. to 4 a.m., partially because they forgot where they had parked Barbara's red VW. When they finally spotted the car, Peter celebrated by kissing Barbara, and their summer romance began. Here's a younger Barbara, circa a 1986 interview, to describe how she felt.
I was attracted to Peter. I don't know if it was just physical or what, but there was this wonderful spark. And we had a very dashing romance in New Orleans, and walking the French Quarter, those narrow streets with the flickering gas lanterns, and I fell in love.
While he was on the seminary campus, he was living in the men's dorm and had made special arrangements with the seminary to stay there and write his National Geographic article. Well, as we began to date, he asked me to read his work. So I sort of became his anonymous editor. I would read his work, and we would disagree over a lot of things and end up in a fight and end up making up with a wonderful embrace and kiss and all that. Well, the time came when he needed to get back on the road. He had finished writing his article on National Geographic, and he needed to walk from New Orleans all the way to Oregon, which was another 3,000 miles. And he wanted me to go with him. I thought, no way, you're crazy. No, no. And again, no. And he kept pursuing me. He said, I know you're supposed to go with me. And I said, well, the only way I'd go with you is if I'm married to you.
Peter had walked away from his home in Alfred, New York on October 15, 1973. He arrived in New Orleans on April 11, 1975. Within that year and a half, Peter had walked over 1,200 miles, lived and worked in a commune, camped on the Appalachian Trail, accepted hospitality and shelter from strangers, lost his dog Cooper in a farming accident, and came within inches of losing his own life. Also, he looked like a Viking and didn't mind wearing a tattered t-shirt and holey boots. Although Barbara admitted that
There was this wonderful spark.
a lot of that spark seemed to have been fueled by their differences.
I had never camped a day in my life. And when I was growing up, my family always referred to me as Miss Priss because I was always prissy and feminine and clean. I didn't like to get my clothes dirty or my hair dirty, and I like to look pretty. And then here comes this Stone Age caveman, sweeps me off my feet. But yet, even with the element of human love, there was no way that I could make that kind of a commitment to Peter without some real help to know what I should do, because I had never been an outdoors girl.
Their differences didn't stop there. 2 years before he met Barbara, Peter had left his first wife, Rhoda, on their college graduation day at Alfred University. He describes the process as a slow decay that even he didn't understand. He'd avoid dinner at home, work at his college art studio until late, then find excuses not to return home until early in the morning. Rhoda would cry and tell him she'd do anything to save their marriage. He'd ask her if they could talk about it later, and they never did. It seems that part of what led him to walk across America was escaping Alfred, New York. And although he says he met Jesus at a James Robison revival near the end of his walk to New Orleans, Barbara could still sense that they were in different places spiritually.
We were worlds apart as far as our roots, our background, and even spiritually. Peter was just a new babe in Christ, and here I was working on a master's degree in religious education. When Peter came into my life and we had reached this place of decision about whether to marry or not, we sought all kinds of help. We talked to our friends on the campus. We talked to counselors. We went in for premarital counseling. And the professor was so opposed to my marrying Peter that he said if we were to marry, we would never last.
My position was, well, you go ahead and finish your walk. And if we feel the same way when you finish, we'll get back together and we'll go from there. And his argument was too many things happen in life during the time I'll be on the road to preserve our relationship. Let's get married. You come with me. Because we were at a seminary and we're all seeking God and his will in our lives, my girlfriends around me position was, well, it's crazy, but if God calls you, then it's up to you. It's your decision.
So I broke up with Peter and I said, I don't want to see you again, but I will go to church with you one last time to see if God will come through, will give me some kind of an answer.
Before the last time we went to church together, I prayed all night long in the chapel on the second floor of the women's dorm. I was praying for guidance. I was praying for some revelation. God, just come down from heaven and tell me what to do. Nothing. It was like the doors of heaven were closed. Nothing.
In lieu of any divine revelation that Saturday night, the next morning, as Barbara warily got herself ready for church, she also got ready to tell Peter goodbye.
Our last time together, I went to church with Peter. It was a non-denominational charismatic church in New Orleans called Word of Faith Temple. I was at a Baptist seminary, but this was a non-denominational church. When we got to the church, in my mind, I was set. After this service, I was going to tell Peter it was over and we cared for each other, but if he still felt the same way, then we'd get back together after he finished the walk. So we get to church. It's packed. There are a few thousand people there. The music is going. It's like a full orchestra up there on stage. And Peter is dressed like he usually was, and his clothes were full of holes, his dirty tennis shoes, his long hair. And I thought, oh, we'll just sit here in the back. No, there were no seats in the back. So the usher takes us to the very front row. We're sitting literally on the front row. I can see the wrinkles in the preacher's face. It so happens on this particular Sunday, they had a guest speaker, and it was an old woman in a wheelchair, and her name was Mom Beal. Never heard of her, didn't know anything about her, and I thought to myself, okay, this is it. This is it, because where I come from, women didn't preach. Back in the Ozarks, they got up and gave their testimony and sang and all that, but they weren't the preachers. Well, they pushed her up to the microphone, and she had this very gentle, grandmotherly voice. And she was 82 years old at the time. And I was feeling pretty smug and arrogant because I thought, here I am. I'm working on a master's in religious education, and I'm so intelligent, and I know so much. Who is this old woman who has no degrees? What does she have to say to me?
The old woman without any degrees began by describing how much snow had fallen in her home city of Detroit, Michigan. She also said that God commanded her to make the trip to New Orleans that weekend. And she explained that she wasn't quite sure why she was in New Orleans, but God had taught her to obey. After that preliminary explanation, she asked everybody to turn to Genesis 24.
At that time, everybody carried their Bibles to church, and you could hear the swoosh of all the thousands of Bibles turning to that scripture.
From the multiple accounts I've heard, this is what I gather. Mom Beal, in her grandmotherly voice, sweetly told the story of Genesis 24. The story is about Abraham, the Old Testament patriarch, asking his servant to go find a wife for Isaac, Abraham's son. Through a small series of fortunate events and God's favor, Abraham's servant finds Rebekah. After he's convinced that Rebekah is the right girl for his master's son Isaac, he has to convince Rebekah and her family that she should come back and marry Isaac. They agreed, but wanted Rebekah to stay for 10 days so they could give her a proper goodbye, which seems like a reasonable request. But Abraham's servant didn't want to delay, so Rebekah's brother Laban asked her one question.
So Mom Beal, she leans into the microphone and she says, today my sermon is called, there was a hush, everybody was waiting, will you go with this man? And I thought, What? Did I hear that correctly? And then she almost shouted in the microphone, "Will you go with this man?" I don't know what it meant to anyone else in that service, but at that moment in history, at that fork in the road, at that exact time, a message came to me, asking me, giving me the choice. Will you go with this man? By the time that 45-minute sermon was over, I was like a wet noodle. I was just putty and kind of weak. Didn't know if I could stand up, but I leaned over and I said to Peter, "Yes, I will go with you."
The book, A Walk Across America, ends triumphantly with Mom Beale's sermon, Barbara saying, "Peter, I'll go with you." Then Peter and Barbara walking out of church holding hands. But that's not the whole story. Here's the younger Barbara to explain.
Peter and I were sitting on the front row, and the ministers were up on the platform, and they were starting to move into the closing part of the service. And the ministers pointed to Peter and me. The whole congregation was standing, and they pointed to Peter and me on the front row, and they said, "Will you please come forward? God has a word for you." We didn't know these ministers. They knew nothing about us. We knew nothing about them. But yet they were calling us forward in front of the whole church. These three ministers gathered around us in front of the church, and they put their hands on us and they began to pray for us. And I had never experienced anything like this, and neither had Peter. And they began to say that God had his hand on us and that God was raising us up for some kind of special ministry that they didn't understand, or neither did we, and that God had called us together before we were formed in the womb.
To Barbara, "Will you go with this man?" was enough of a sign to answer all her prayers. So maybe that's why the second part wasn't included in the book. After all, no author or writer can include every cool part of a true story. But there is something specific in the afterword pages of the book that made me pause. I'm quoting Peter Jenkins on page 287. Quote, "Since that November Sunday in 1975, Barbara and I have been together. We were married in February of 1976 and started our walk across the rest of America from New Orleans on July 5th, 1976. We've had an amazing 2-year honeymoon, walking, working, and sweating our way through Louisiana, Texas, and New Mexico, and into Colorado." Unquote. The pause hits me at, quote, "We've had an amazing 2-year honeymoon, walking, working, and sweating," unquote. At the beginning of his book, Peter's writing strikes me as raw and vulnerable. He describes his hedonistic pleasure-seeking of 1969, staying out late to avoid his first wife, and the unsettled feeling he had after his divorce. And maybe the 2-year honeymoon was just a lazier, tongue-in-cheek way to quickly summarize 2 years of walking together. But for a book that starts off so raw and an author who seems so authentic, his last comments feel glossy and heavily edited.
Walking across southern Louisiana was like walking underwater. It was so hot and swampy and humid and mosquitoes, and camped one night in the brush. We had to get off the road because this car had been following us. It was an old, kind of muddy old car. And this man driving this car had gone up and down the road 3 or 4 times, and it was almost dark. We did not carry guns or weapons, so we had to be very smart. We had to be off the road at dark and on the road as early as we could, because we could walk in daylight hours. Well, this car kept kind of patrolling us and going back and forth, and we both felt very uneasy. So we found this kind of lowland, swampy-looking place, heavy brush, lots of pine trees. When he got out of sight, we darted off into that underbrush, and we waited. We must have waited 30, 40 minutes to make sure that he was gone. He came back once and then left. So we quietly set up our tent and crawled in the tent. And so we zipped the door shut and immediately fell asleep, because when you walk 15, 20 miles a day with carrying all that weight on your back, when you finally get to rest, I mean, you're out. Your body needs the rest. But I woke up in the night scratching and itching, and then I would hear hoot owls, and I'd hear twigs snap and this and that. And we weren't far off a bayou, and I thought, oh, dear God, I hope an alligator doesn't come up here, because all that was between us and all of nature were thin nylon walls. Well, the next morning we got up. It was early, but it was humid, and I was scratching, and I thought, man, I've just been eaten up with mosquitoes. And I looked down, and I had all these tiny dots all over me, and I was covered in thousands of seed ticks. And I started jumping up and down and screaming, getting everything off of me as much as I could. We got out of the brush, back onto the road, and I think it took me 2 or 3 weeks to get all the ticks off of me.
Barbara had trained for the Walk West by running, but she hadn't trained for thousands of ticks or swarms of swampland mosquitoes. In 1976, locals in the bayou referred to the mosquito as the Louisiana state bird. Barbara was miserable.
We were sleeping on the ground, walking in 100-degree heat, 15 to 20 miles a day. Peter and I fought a lot. He was demanding. He was not sympathetic. He expected me to keep up with him, and I couldn't. And so because of that, he usually walked a long distance ahead of me.
In the picture that made their walk iconic, Peter and Barbara are walking within an arm's length of each other, wearing shorts, t-shirts, hiking boots, sunglasses, and oversized JanSport camping backpacks with a pair of matching red and white and blue and white umbrellas mounted to each backpack to shield each of them from the sun. It's quite a sight. The picture seems spontaneous and unfiltered. It even captures the rough texture of the asphalt highway. But even though Snapchat and Instagram filters didn't exist back then, it turns out this famous image was much different than reality.
Going to bed every night with the two of us having walked all day, sweating. I mean, the tent smelled worse than any gym locker room ever. Yeah. After the first 300 miles of this, I decided, God or no God, call or no call, this was it. I was going to forget this thing. And I would just go back to New Orleans and get the Volkswagen and just drive along behind Peter, follow him along. And I was going to quit. I had made up my mind. There was nothing that could change my mind. Even God this time couldn't do it.
Wow, bold words. Barbara might have wanted to quit, but I bet you'll want to continue, because after this short break, well, you'll find out. When we left off, Barbara and Peter were walking through the bayou of Louisiana, and Barbara said even God couldn't stop her from telling Peter, "See you later, alligator."
So we were out in the swamps in Louisiana helping trap alligators. We were living with some Cajuns, and we were helping trap alligators, and I was the first woman that they allowed to go out in the mud boats to help harvest the alligators. So here we were 6 miles out in the swamp, and this man showed up just as a visitor to observe and to see what it was like, and he happened to be a preacher from Oklahoma. And when he laid eyes on us out here in the middle of the swamps, he said, I don't know, but I have an urge to pray for you two. Could I pray for you? And so he asked us to get on our knees, and this man began to pray for us, and he said, I don't know why God has sent me here, but the Lord wants you to know He's going to raise you up so that your name will be known from mainland to mainland and coast to coast, and that whatever you're doing, to keep on doing it.
Turns out something could change your mind. And it was the same type of thing that convinced her to go on the walk in the first place. But although she continued, she wasn't always happy about it.
We had walked from New Orleans all the way to West Texas. I had tons of blisters on my feet. I was sunburned. My lips were cracked. My hair was wild. I had to adjust to sleeping on the ground, not knowing where my next meal was coming from. So every day was like being born again and readjusting to this new person that I was becoming. So we walked into this little West Texas town, and you can imagine, the longhorn cattle are crossing the street, dust is in the air, and it's hot. Oh, it's hot. My hair was up in a hat, matted to my head. My face was sweaty and full of dirt. Of course, no makeup. We'd walked all day, and when we would come into a little town, we'd try to find a cheap motel so we could get a bath. That was one of the hardest things, was being dirty. But there were times we went days and days without a bath. So we entered this little dusty town in Seymour, Texas, like one little main street. We were at a stoplight, and up pulls this big, shiny green Lincoln Continental, and inside, I think, 5 women. And their hair was coiffed and sprayed, and they had on tons of makeup, and they looked like probably some rich rancher's wives, and they were off to their luncheon or party. They took one look at me on the street corner, and I heard the click of all the doors. They locked all their doors. We made it to this little motel, and we went in. Of course, it had 1950s furniture, and it smelled dank and smoky and dusty and moldy. And Peter went out to go walk somewhere and find us some hamburgers or something to eat, and all I cared about was getting a shower. And I happened to pass the mirror and saw this thing in the mirror. It was this human being, and I didn't recognize who this was. Meanwhile, on the television was the Miss World Beauty Contest, and all these beautiful girls in their gowns and everything were walking across the stage. And I'd look at the screen on the television, and then I looked at myself in the mirror. And it was like a matrix, alternate universes. I was a totally different person. My skin was sunburned. I was beet red. My lips were cracked and bleeding. I was dirty from head to foot. All I cared about was going and taking a shower. And so when I stepped in the shower, as the water was washing off the dirt and the mud, I'd come to the place on this walk and in my life where I really didn't care what people thought of me. I really didn't care. I had learned to take life one step at a time and one day at a time. And God was working on the inside of me. So it was no longer about how I looked on the outside.
In college, Barbara was voted the yearbook queen, and she says she always cared about how she looked. But as Barbara became less self-conscious, the walk began to change her.
I walked 2 miles an hour. When you're on foot, everything slows down to a point where you see the rabbits on the side of the road. You feel the breeze. There's a scripture in the Bible where God told Abraham, he said, "Abraham, arise and walk through the land, and I will give it unto thee." Well, in many ways, I feel like Abraham, because I did arise and I walked across America. And in many ways, I absorbed the land, the people, the climate, the culture, and God gave it to me. So back then, the news media, newspapers, media, everything was about the latest crime, disaster, something. What we found were gracious, salt-of-the-earth type of people, ordinary people, hardworking people, ranchers, farmers, teachers, mothers, housekeepers, just regular people. There was less to be afraid of and more to learn and experience. Let me tell you about Homer and Ruby Martin in West Texas. They were dry farmers. They raised cotton. Never had children. They were in their 60s when we met them. Homer was a tall man, wore a big cowboy hat, cowboy boots, looked like a traditional cowboy. Ruby, his wife, she was about my size, had gray wavy hair. She looked like something out of the 1920s. And she actually went to Texas as a child in a covered wagon. But her face was totally covered in wrinkles. She had spent her life picking cotton, working hard, and so it had weathered her a lot. But her eyes were blue and they danced. They were humble people. Salt-of-the-earth people are people who know who they are. They're close to the earth. They raised longhorn cattle. They had a corral a few miles down the road, and they had an old 1940s pickup truck. So one day, Ruby said, "Come on, Barbara, let's go check on my babies." She never had children, so those cows were her babies. We jumped in the truck and drove down there, and I hung out over the edge of the corral. She got in the corral with these huge animals, and this one bull, he at least 2,000 pounds, horns, red eyes. He snorted, he pawed the ground. She was trying to move them from one corral to the other, and he wouldn't move. And she broke off a mesquite switch. And if you know what mesquite trees are in West Texas, they're kind of willowy trees, but they have thorns on them. She broke off a long switch, and she switched that bull on the rear, and she hollered at him, called him a name. But she hollered at him, and she said, "I said to move." Well, that bull, he pawed the ground, lowered his head and snorted, and dust flew everywhere. She hollered again and slapped him on the rear. She said, "I cover the ground I stand on, and I said to move." Well, that old bull, he looked at her and snorted again, and by golly, he moved.
Ruby, like many of the women Barbara met, lived a mostly anonymous life. But Ruby knew who she was, her husband knew who she was, and even a longhorn bull backed down from her and her stubborn grit. As Peter and Barbara met more salt-of-the-earth families, Barbara absorbed that stubborn grit, and there were many times she needed it. Lightning incinerated a telephone pole so close to them, they could hear it sizzle. A car full of men threatened to kill them and search for them multiple times in one night. A car hit Barbara so hard she flew at least 50 feet and landed in the yard of a Mormon funeral home. She went to the hospital and was back on the road in 6 days. But Barbara doesn't just credit the character traits she absorbed from other people for her ability to persevere. She credits God for sending people to help her, even when Peter was too focused on the next destination to set his sights on helping her.
When we were crossing Oregon, we had 400 miles left to walk, and it was the coldest winter since 1919. Blizzards, whiteouts, 10 below. And we were like horses headed to the barn. We'd walked so many miles, so many years. We were ready to finish this walk. And we had met this mountain preacher. His name was Milo Frankie. He looked like something out of a Western movie. He had long, gray lamb chop sideburns, gray hair. He wore a big black cowboy hat. He had icy blue eyes that were like lasers. They could just see straight to your soul. He wore cowboy boots. He also wore a long black coat. So he kind of reminded me of Johnny Cash, only he was a mountain preacher. In his history, he rode horses and motorcycles back up into the timber country and to preach to the loggers and the miners and the ranchers and the rough men. And he'd go into saloons and sit next to men hanging over their whiskey and talk to them about the Lord. Well, we were in John Day, Oregon, and we met him, and he said, "You will surely perish if you do not have help crossing these Cascade Mountains," because the winter was so hazardous. Milo got permission from his little church to follow along beside us, crossing the Cascades at 2 miles an hour so that we didn't perish. He got in his little old, I think it was a little old Ford Falcon, had a tape deck in it. And he would drive along beside me, and I was freezing. And I'd also just learned that I was 2 months pregnant, so I was sick as a dog. And there was no way I could have made it without him. He was what I call my my old mountain logger preacher angel. He drove along beside me at 2 miles an hour with the window rolled down and the heat blasting, and he'd pop in an old gospel tape, turn it up as loud as it would go. And, you know, I wasn't crazy about gospel music, but he would shout at me, "Come on, Barbara, baby, you walk and I'll throw up." And he would get out of his car and roll in the snow to make me laugh and to keep me going. And it was about 3 or 4 days of that to get us across the pass. Once you get across the Cascades, you dip into almost an oceanic climate where it's lots of ferns, tall pine trees. It's a more moderate climate. So once we got out of the blizzards in the high desert and crossed into this more moderate climate, then Milo turned his little car around and headed back through the storms and across the Cascades back to his little town of John Day, Oregon, and his little church.
With the help of Milo and others, Barbara and Peter successfully crossed their real-life Oregon Trail. But before they arrived at the Pacific Coast in Florence, they invited the friends they had made from all over America to join them for their last mile. Here's Peter via that 1986 interview to explain.
I had started on October 13th, 1973. 5.25 years later, we sent the invitations out with just 1 month advance notice. We didn't think anyone would show up, but we wanted to let them know that it wasn't us that walked across America. It was them that made the trip. So about 300 of them hitchhiked, drove, flew, drove around blizzards. There was horrible blizzards that year.
People drove all the way from Louisiana. My parents drove all the way from Missouri. We had people from
New York,
Alabama, New York, North Carolina. The Black family came. National Geographic came.
Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, all over.
Idaho.
Barbara's grandmother from Arizona.
My grandmother, who's 83, we invited her to come, and she walked between us the last mile. We had one last sand dune to cross up over before we got to the ocean. And that day, which is a rainy season on the Oregon coast, January the 18th, there were big clouds coming in. The weatherman said it would rain all day. Well, that morning, the sun was shining. It was one of those clear, crisp, brilliant blue mornings. And Grandma led the way, 83 years old, and as we got to that last sand dune, she had to stop and get her little nitroglycerin pill because her heart was fluttering. And then when we crossed that last sand dune, Peter and I dropped Grandma's hand and we joined hands. And this was our moment while all the people watched.
Then Peter and I broke away from the crowd and walked on down. The crowd was on the beach cheering, and we walked into the ocean knee-deep and embraced and raised our hands in victory.
And then there was about 100 people that were so moved that they just went right into the ocean. We all went right, and this
right
is genuine.
Into the ocean.
And everybody was hugging and kissing and crying and laughing, and it's something we'll never ever forget.
Not only did 300 friends walk the last mile with them into the Pacific Ocean, a crowd of photographers and journalists on the beach, and even some circling in a helicopter, captured every moment as they walked into the Pacific.
One of the main headlines from one of the main papers in Oregon, they called it a media beach party.
I'm going to read you some of the captions from actual photos I found in 2 Oregon newspapers that covered the story. The last mile. Peter Jenkins and Old Glory lead crowd as he walks last mile to Pacific Ocean. End of the road kiss. Ankle deep at end of trek across America. Peter Jenkins shares kiss and hug with wife Barbara Jo.
2 days after we ended this walk, crying in the ocean, after being on the road and never leaving for 5 years, living in a tent, and like we just described, I went on what's called a promo tour around 25 cities of America via jet, right, to talk about my book, A Walk Across America.
I ended the walk about a month and a half pregnant. And so when Peter left the coast of Oregon to make this book promotional tour, I went back to Twin Falls, Idaho with some people that we had lived with and stayed with them 3 to 4 weeks while Peter was on this tour.
The first day was Los Angeles, well really, Beverly Hills, California, the Beverly Hills Hotel, Pink Hotel. Limousines, movie stars walking through the lobby, fountains. I was so hungry that night that I got in there, and I looked in the menu for something to eat. There was no prices. So I thought, shoot, I'll just order whatever I want. So I started out with a chicken salad sandwich. I mean, I could consume some food. And so I ordered a chicken salad sandwich just like as an appetizer. Came up $8.
According to a consensus of inflation calculator sites, $8 in 1979 did not equal a Chick-fil-A meal. It equaled over 4 times that, or $36.25 to be exact, or Chick-fil-A meals for a whole family of 4 and maybe a neighbor kid or 2. A couple weeks before, Peter hadn't always known where he and his pregnant wife's next meal was coming from. But on his first day of promo tour, he ate a $36 sandwich. After his promo tour, Peter and Barbara lived in the Mayflower Hotel, a luxury hotel in Washington, D.C., for 6 weeks, finishing up Peter and Barbara's next National Geographic article. 6 months later, in 1979, Barbara was due to give birth to their first child, and after a long and difficult delivery, their daughter was born.
Rebecca was born August 18th, 1979. We named her Rebecca after the sermon, Will You Go With This Man?, the story of Isaac and Rebecca in the Bible. And what a contrast. The month that Rebecca was born was the very same month that Peter and I were on the cover of National Geographic magazine. And we were so involved with this new baby that we could care less about all of this hoopla.
And you know what was scary, Jim, to me and to Barbara was we were afraid, honestly, that maybe this would all end. Maybe now that we were finished with our walk and our wonderful adventure and we were going to settle down and have a family, that our adventuresome life would end and our adventure with God would end.
And that God would stop coming through for us.
Just because we might travel in a jet or a car or a pickup truck and travel around and settle down with a family, maybe that all of it would end. But it hasn't. It's as much of an adventure as it ever was.
A week or two before Barbara gave birth to Rebecca, they landed on the front page of National Geographic magazine, which meant their iconic picture in travel gear and matching umbrellas sat on the nightstands and coffee tables in 5 to 8 million homes. But when the magazine arrived in the Jenkins mailbox, Barbara was almost 10 months pregnant, and she says she wouldn't have cared if it was a winning lottery ticket. But the thing is, for all practical purposes, that issue of National Geographic was a winning lottery ticket. And Barbara might not have cared, but Peter did. 3 hours after Barbara arrived home from the hospital with Rebecca, Peter flew to New York to appear on Good Morning America. If you want to hear what happens to Peter and Barbara, don't fly away to Good Morning America. Stick around until after this short break. When we left off, Peter had left too, for New York 3 hours after Barbara arrived home with her newborn Rebecca. And Barbara says the travel never stopped. After a few months, she and her newborn baby hit the road with Peter. And by the time Rebecca was 8 months old, she had traveled to nearly half the country. Peter's first book hit #1 and stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for 3 months. Peter and Barbara co-authored the sequel, and it hit #4.
We were on the national news, on magazine covers, on radio stations, on Good Morning America, on the Today Show, lots of national media. And we were on the front page of many, many newspapers. If not on their front page, we were in the living section. We were on a lot of Christian programs. We did 5 days of series on Focus on the Family. I was on the 700 Club with Pat Robertson. We were on PTL Club back with Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. I remember sitting next to Tammy Faye on stage and thinking, oh dear Lord, I mean, you know, she was crying and the mascara coming down her face. I thought something was wrong. And so anyway, I don't know that anyone stood out more than others. Maybe Jerry Falwell in the Old Time Gospel Hour. That was a Sunday morning, and it was a live show. Peter had gotten up to talk about the walk, and he told a lot of stories. Peter was a great speaker. He went on and on. Finally, Jerry Falwell leaned over, and this is in front of cameras and millions of viewers, and said, Peter, why don't you let Barbara talk? And so I got up and told a couple of stories that I've probably told here today. And I'll never forget that.
A Walk Across America and The Walk West, the first 2 books either of them had ever authored, sold millions of copies. They moved to a 135-acre farm just south of Nashville, Tennessee. And even with the birth of 2 more kids, Jed and Luke, the media frenzy never seemed to die down. Peter and Barbara solidified their standing as national celebrities, and the prophetic prayers prayed at Word of Faith Temple and by an Oklahoman preacher had proved to be true. God had raised them up, and their names were known from coast to coast.
We were considered America's sweetheart couple, America's sweet Christian couple. And I wanted that to be so true. But behind the scenes, when the camera was off, we never went to bed together in all the years. He was gone every night. And then he traveled most of the other times.
The next year, Peter flew to New York and missed Rebecca's first birthday, and Barbara's birthday as well. He paced the floor while at home and was usually too preoccupied mentally to help with his firstborn. As they had more children, he rented a cabin on Center Hill Lake in Tennessee because he didn't like to write in proximity to noisy kids. He was regularly gone for months at a time. Earlier, Peter spoke for Barbara in saying that they both were scared that their adventure might end. But when I listened to that old interview again, it sounds like that was only Peter's fear. When their interview was released during the week of July 4th, 1986, Barbara feared something else.
I'd spent 3 years walking across America. I had 3 babies. We had books that we had written. I mean, we had built a kingdom. So when the camera was on, I smiled and I was the sweet little wife baking cookies and reading the Bible and taking care of the children, when behind closed doors, the marriage was a fake and falling apart.
When Barbara was 8 months pregnant with her third child, Peter and his research assistant Rita left for China to have another adventure and start writing another book. He returned shortly before his youngest son was born. Barbara prayed a third baby would turn things around for Peter, but instead, Peter seemed more cold, distant, and critical of Barbara.
I had given birth to our youngest son. He was about 2. Over the course of a year, I'd started receiving a lot of anonymous phone calls and messages on my machine. That was back when you had answering machines. They would tell me things that I just did not want to believe. I was alerted and started doing research. And within a few months, I had records, hotel receipts, documentation. I had the things to prove what was going on.
Barbara says she knew that there were at least 2 other women, possibly 5. One night, as Barbara sat in their business office gathering documents, one of her children's babysitters stopped in. The babysitter had recently turned 18, and because this girl's dad had passed away, Barbara knew she looked up to Peter as a father figure. When Barbara solemnly spilled the news to the babysitter about Peter's infidelity, the 18-year-old girl turned pale, started crying, and said, "Oh, Barbara, I never meant to hurt you."
Like most women, when they find out their spouse has been unfaithful, if you have children and you've built a life together, you don't want to tear it all down. You've built a network of family and friends, and you have this whole structure, this whole kingdom. No one at the very basis really wants a divorce, but I was forced into it.
After Peter heard that Barbara filed for divorce, Peter continued his Across China book tour. And while he was giving interviews to dispel rumors and boost book sales, Barbara changed her telephone number, locked the front gate of their farm, and tried to protect her children from the press. As Peter hired a prominent Nashville attorney to send out a press release declaring his hopes for reconciliation, Barbara quietly closed their business office, laid off their staff, packed up Peter's car with his belongings, and left it at the airport for him.
Let's just say it this way. Everything we touched turned to gold. I mean, just to do a little speech was $10,000. That was a lot of money back then. We had remodeled a beautiful farmhouse. It was like a mansion on about 200 acres. I mean, it was a dream life. 3 children growing up. It was like Norman Rockwell. Outwardly, everything was beautiful. But on the inside were these big, gaping, bleeding holes. For me to stand up and file for divorce, I was basically losing it all.
Barbara lost Peter. She lost their business, and their book sales dwindled. And 10 months after the divorce was final, Peter took his kids to Michigan on a visitation weekend and married his research assistant, Rita, in a formal church wedding. 1 week after the marriage, Peter and his new family moved into the ranch house across the field from Barbara and the 3 kids. Rita enrolled her children from a previous marriage in the same school as Barbara's, and Barbara's kids were asked to call Rita Mom. In response, Barbara moved 30 minutes away from her farm. My mom never told me Barbara and Peter's story because this is the ending no one wants to hear.
After the divorce, it was years and years and years of lawsuits. The money dried up. I struggled to make it financially. I had to beg every month for child support. My youngest son had major medical bills. So it was years and years of struggles financially, emotionally.
Recently, I read another book, So Long as It's Wild by Peter Jenkins. And after I read it, I interviewed Barbara. Then I called my mom. But this time, I didn't call her to tell her a wild story of a lady preacher delivering a well-timed message. I called her to tell her what Barbara said when I asked her if she believes God really spoke to her all those years ago.
Yes, absolutely. You know, that call was for me. Will you go with this man? That was my decision. Now, if the man made a decision to go another direction, I can't help that. I don't fault God. I don't blame God. I don't feel like God let me down in any way. I don't feel like it was a mistake because I don't believe I would have ever come into my full identity had I not married Peter, walked across America, been on the cover of National Geographic, been famous, then divorced, lose it all, find my way again, be a single parent, build a real estate company, sit on governor's boards, be chairman of boards. I don't think I would have found or fulfilled the many directions and avenues that God opened and had for me. I've always said I could live to be 120 and still not do all the things that are in my heart. And so I don't look back with regret. If I have any regrets, it's my own shortcomings and my failures and my sins.
Almost 50 years have passed since Peter and Barbara's walk across America, and almost 40 years since their divorce. For most of those 40 years, friends and publishers have asked Barbara to write her side of the story. But she didn't really want to dig up all those old memories. Instead of writing another book or having another adventure, she wanted to focus on her family and provide love and attention to her 3 kids and now her 2 granddaughters. After years of encouragement and pressure to write a book, though, Barbara would say that God sent her another messenger with a well-timed question. And this time, the messenger wasn't an elderly woman behind a pulpit.
My granddaughter, she was 7 years old at the time. She calls me Yo-Yo. And she said, Yo-Yo, did you really walk across America?
Thanks for listening. If you like this story, hit follow or subscribe now. Also, please give our show a 5-star review on your podcast app. Doing so helps other people find it. And if you've heard a story you want to share with me, go to godoutloud.com, scroll to the bottom, and hit record. The theme song is written by me, Rob Vischer, and produced by my fellow Michigan native turned Tennessean, Joe Fry. Thanks to Peter Jenkins for your time and interview. If you love this show, show us some love and text this episode's link to your friends. Thanks again for listening to If you want to hear more stories of people who claim they heard God, go to godoutloud.com/donate. It takes time to interview, edit, and create this podcast. 60 to 80 hours per episode, 2 weeks of paid time off. In other words, time goes by so fast when I'm making this podcast. 80 hours of fun equals 1 episode done. And it is so rewarding from the time I start recording to the time it pops up on your phone and you listen while you're driving home. I love to interview, edit, and create. If you like to listen to one thing and don't wait, go to godoutloud.com/donate. We're raising $20,000 to make season 3, and once we hit that goal, we'll start tracking down more stories, interviewing guests, and creating another 10 episodes for season 3. Go to godoutloud.com/donate.
My greatest glory are my children and my grandchildren. And that's why I didn't really want to write about it, because my intention was never to hurt or expose Peter. He's the father of my children. And I really had to have permission from my children to tell this story, because there's no purpose in exposing anyone. Peter's the father of my children. I loved him. I will always love him and pray for him and wish him the best. My prayer for him is that he's made peace with God and with himself. All of us are going to die and we're going to meet our Maker. I'm not just pointing at Peter. I mean, I was self-righteous and stubborn, and all of us need to come to the end of ourselves where we realize, I am only here by the grace of God. I am only breathing the next breath because of God's mercy. Who am I to brag about anything?
When was the last time you heard a story that you couldn't wait to share? Hi, I'm Annie Manus from the Story Partners podcast. We love telling gripping stories of people who have experienced the power of God in their lives. In the Story Partners podcast, we get to the heart of our characters. Our subjects bring you into the depth of their pain, their struggles, and their victories. Here's Tim Schulte from Season 2, Episode 9, called The Encounter.
She just said, "Hey, Mom's having an affair, and she's leaving." Immediately, shock, confusion. I just remember great sadness. I said, "Lord, please help my mom to stay." We finished praying. She looked at me with her loving smile, kissed me on the forehead, and that was the last time she ever took me in.
Check out the rest of Tim's story at the Story Partners podcast.